dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks, doing hard time for these WikiLeaks, trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat, and then they gag you. You don't get to speak, and when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masters of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Free speech is the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people of the red, white and blue, you keep them in bed. Seeing the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat until I'm deceased underneath a freezing red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. And outside my window a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey with my Mickey keeps dying in my kidneys weak. Silence in my risky tweets is what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace like 7 years under threat. Cause I've released 7 vaults, they upset. They under the rape sentence, but the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. MLK to Gandhi, take aim and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. When the vote count is irregular, you kill the messenger. You caught spying on a senator, you kill the messenger. Removing voters from the register, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. In my dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks, doing hard time for these WikiLeaks, trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat, and then they gag you. You don't get to speak, and when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masters of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Playing on the regular, you kill the messenger. Free speech is the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people want the red, white and blue, you keep them in bed. Seeking the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat until I'm deceased underneath a freezing red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Outside my window, a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey what my Mickey keeps, dying in my kidneys weak. Silence of my risky tweets is what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace, like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace, like 7 years under threat. Cause I've released 7 bars, they upset. They ended the rape sentence, but the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. MLK to Gandhi, take him and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. You kill the messenger. You kill the messenger. Democracy dies in the darkness. Darkness. Feeling cold now, I got the heater on. Feeling sold out, even though I'm keeping strong. But can I hold out when every bit of freedom's gone? They want me rolled out, never to sing freedom song. I wanna see the sky, I wanna feel the rain. But gotta keep away from windows, that's some window pane. It's just a shame, couldn't have planned out all our dreams. Now I scream, cause there's a man in the machine. But the train is off the tracks, and damn it's losing steam. I wanna call Christine, I haven't seen since 013. I'm missing life like 3 strikes each night. Seems like 3 nights ain't right. Can't fight, space light, hate life. Wanting to be snake-like, shedding off this gray life. In the dark can't make light, but where I'm headed now is brake lights. Where I'm headed now they break lights. Counting days like brake lights. Feeling weight like brake lights. Had a great life. Brake lights. Brake lights. Brake lights. Out of place like brake lights. In my face like brake lights. Counting days like brake lights. Brake lights. Brake lights. Sit here asking, what have I done? If these strings were cut, I'd see my son. And if I could just fly from this place, then I'd hold you in my love embrace. And if I could just speak to you now, I'd renew my vow and be in the now. Is this me in denial? Wanna remove stress from your brow and pay you back some way, somehow. But it's painted black, can see the way back now. But how's the house and how's your mom? I doubt the way the media portrays me makes you hate me. But to think you see that daily makes me crazy, that just ain't me.
This is without a doubt going to be this generation's Free Mandela movement. Every single generation must fight again the same battles that previous generations have fought.
Brake lights, counting days like brake lights, 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 brake lights. my dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks, doing hard time for these WikiLeaks, trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat, and then they gag you. You don't get to speak, and when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masses of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Free speech, it's the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people up the red, white and blue, you keep them in bed. Seeing the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat until I'm deceased underneath a freezing red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. And outside my window a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey with my Mickey keeps dying in my kidneys weak. Silence in my risky tweets is what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace like 7 years under threat. Cause I've released 7 vaults, they upset. They under the rape sentence, but the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. MLK to Gandhi, take aim and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. When the vote count is irregular, you kill the messenger. You caught spying on a senator, you kill the messenger. Removing voters from the register, you kill the messenger. Need to silence any questioners, you kill the messenger. In my dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks, doing hard time for these WikiLeaks, trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat, and then they gag you. You don't get to speak, and when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masters of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Playing on the regular, you kill the messenger. Free speech is the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people want the red, white and blue, you keep them in bed. Seeking the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat until I'm deceased underneath a freezer red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger.
Welcome to the 12th Unity for J online vigil for WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange. I'm Joe Lauria, editor-in-chief from Consortium News. Julian Assange is a wanted man because he published classified information that revealed the crimes and corruption of government officials around the world, not just in the United States. But it is the US, the supposed beacon of freedom and democracy and press freedom around the world, that has indicted him and wants him extradited to the US for the crime of publishing. That's why Julian Assange has been a refugee in the Ecuadorian embassy in London for the past 6 years. He knows the second he steps back onto British territory, he'll be arrested and sent to the US, where he's unlikely to receive a fair trial and would be likely spending the rest of his life in prison. As we do every week, and we're now holding these on Fridays, every Friday, and in the new time, 4 p.m. Eastern time to 7 p.m. Eastern time in the United States East Coast. I'm actually in daylight for the first time. So I'm going to read the headlines that of the last week about the situation of Julian Assange on WikiLeaks. At the top is Mairead Maguire, former Nobel Peace Laureate. She nominated Julian Assange last Monday for the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize. And I would like to read her statement because I think it's quite a good one. Why she nominated Julian Assange for the Nobel Peace Prize, a great development for those defenders of WikiLeaks. She writes, Julian Assange and his colleagues in WikiLeaks have shown on numerous occasions that they are one of the last outlets of true democracy. Their work for true peace by making public our government's actions at home and abroad has enlightened us to atrocities carried out in the name of so-called democracy around the world. This included footage of inhumanity carried out by NATO and the military, the release of email correspondence revealing the plotting of regime change in Middle Eastern countries, and the parts our elected officials played in deceiving the public. This is a huge step in our work for disarmament and nonviolence worldwide. Julian Assange, fearing deportation to the US to stand trial for treason, sought out asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy in 2012. In recent months, the US has increased pressure on the Ecuadorian government to take away his last liberties. He's now prevented from having visitors, although that's been slightly relaxed in the last few weeks, receiving telephone calls or other electronic communications, thereby removing his basic human rights. This has put a great strain on Julian's mental and physical health. It is our duty as citizens to protect Julian's human rights and freedom of speech as he has fought for ours on a global stage. It is my great fear that Julian, who is an innocent man, will be deported to the US, where he will face unjustified imprisonment. We've seen this happen to Chelsea Manning, who allegedly supplied WikiLeaks with sensitive information from NATO and U.S. Middle Eastern wars, and subsequently spent a number of years in solitary confinement in an American prison. If the U.S. succeeds in their plan to extradite Julian Assange to the U.S. to face a grand jury, this will silence journalists and whistleblowers around the world in fear of dire repercussions. Julian Assange meets all criteria for the Nobel Peace Prize. Through his release of hidden information to the public, we are no longer naive to the atrocities of war. We are no longer oblivious to the connections between big business, the acquisition of resources, and the spoils of war. As his human rights and freedom are in jeopardy, the Nobel Peace Prize would afford Julian much greater protection from government forces. Over the years, there have been controversies over the Nobel Peace Prize, and some of those to whom it has been awarded. Sadly, I believe it has moved from its original intentions and meaning. It was Alfred Nobel's will that the prize would support and protect individuals at threat from government forces in their fight for nonviolence and peace by bringing awareness to their precarious situations. Through awarding Julian Assange the Nobel Peace Prize, he and others like him will receive the protection they truly deserve. It is my hope that by this we can rediscover the true definition of the Nobel Peace Prize. I also call on all people to bring awareness to Julian's situation and support him in his struggle for basic human rights, freedom of speech, and peace. Mairead Maguire. Also in the headlines, former Australian Ambassador Tony Kevin reiterated his support for Julian Assange. She tweeted, "I have always called for Assange's release and his safely escorted return home to Australia in an RAAF aircraft. This innocent man is being treated so badly by Ecuador, UK, and US governments." We hope to have Ambassador Kevin to join us later in the program. He's been invited. As I pointed out in reading Mairead Maguire's comment that Julian has had a short window now of visitors being allowed. We know that John Pilger visited Julian twice in the last few weeks. We've had a theater director, Angela Richter, meet him, and Cassandra Fairbanks, who's been a guest on these vigils, visited Julian Assange last Monday. She reports that his living conditions are more akin to a dissident in Stasi-era Germany than an award-winning publisher with asylum. And Fairbanks describes the numerous cameras that are displayed throughout the corridors and in the room where she met Julian Assange as well, and that's why she feels she's in a Stasi-era embassy. On Wednesday, WikiLeaks issued official denial of Trump election contacts, saying that the organization never provided election information to Donald Trump campaign advisor Roger Stone or to Jerome Corsi, a conservative author and conspiracy advocate. That's a quote from WikiLeaks, a firm denial of any connection with those men linked to the Trump campaign. Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister of Greece, his organization, DIEM 25, on January 4th launched a petition calling on governments of Ecuador and the UK to prevent the extradition of Julian Assange to the US. It has more than 8,000 signatures. As I mentioned, theater director Angela Richter also visited Julian, and she writes, "When I asked him how he had endured the isolation for so long, he replies that he was almost delighted at first. He was sure that such a flagrant violation of his human rights would cause great public outrage, and European politicians would stand up for him because of pressure from the media. Nothing of the sort happened, however, and as the months passed, he lost faith." This is why we have these vigils, and we're going to certainly discuss why there hasn't been that public outrage. As we mentioned last week, Ecuador has begun a special examination of Julian Assange's asylum and citizenship as it looks for an IMF bailout. This is a big development, and we did talk a little bit about it last week, but it's worth mentioning again, because as some suspected, Ecuador holding a very important asset for the United States, namely Julian Assange, would certainly want something in return for handing him over, as all governments deal in that way. It appears, if this story is accurate, that one thing they would want is an IMF deal that would allow them a new loan and to pay off apparently $2 billion that they owe to China, amongst other debts I'm sure that Ecuador has. But what's curious about this story, actually a reaction to this story, is an article I saw in Daily Beast, which looks like disinformation. Daily Beast is notoriously unreliable and an anti-WikiLeaks publication. They make a big deal of going after Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And it is an article from Quito, the capital of Ecuador, in which a member of parliament there was interviewed and other people were interviewed, in which this article pretends to say that they don't really care about Julian Assange very much. It's not a big deal like some websites and this Vigil in particular makes out of what's going on, that they don't really care and it's all really nonsense. So you might want to look at that article if you want a good laugh. There's been no more news on Rudy Giuliani, which is basically bad news. Giuliani, as we all know, just before New Year's Eve, had made a statement on Fox News in which he compared WikiLeaks publications to the Pentagon Papers. And he said that when that happened, no reporter or no editor from the Washington Post or the New York Times had been arrested and gone to jail. And therefore, Julian Assange shouldn't be arrested and go to jail because he's doing the same thing that the Times and the Post did with the papers, and that what mainstream media has done ever since, which is to publish classified information without consequence. So it was a very significant statement from Rudy Giuliani, the former New York mayor, of course, and federal prosecutor, and now an advisor and lawyer for President Donald Trump, why we thought it was significant is because he's an advisor to President Donald Trump, who has the means to issue a pardon even before an arrest is made. There are charges, as we know, in this Alexandria, Virginia courthouse down the street from me here. And so he's been charged, and Trump can pardon him if he has the guts to do that. Of course, it'll be attacked as being a partisan move, and that would supposedly appear to be more evidence that Trump was delivered the presidency by one Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, which, of course, anyone who understands anything about the 2016 election knows that that's just not true, that Julian Assange did not give Donald Trump the White House. Hillary Clinton gave Donald Trump the White House. She was an awful candidate. She made numerous mistakes, not campaigning in Wisconsin and other working class states, and calling Trump supporters, working class people, deplorable, and the fact that she made those speeches to Goldman Sachs and other big banks on Wall Street, in which she clearly is siding with them against the people and with the elites. And if she had not done that, and if her campaign had not tried to sabotage Bernie Sanders, as all the leaks of all the emails published by WikiLeaks show, if she had been a model candidate, we would have read nothing. As Scott Horton on this show a couple of weeks ago pointed out, if she'd been a great Secretary of State, no one would have been interested in those emails. They would have been boring. But of course, it was revealed in those emails just how corrupt Hillary Clinton is. And to blame the messenger, WikiLeaks in this case, is just bad form, frankly, because she lost because of her own bad campaigning. And she's not the politician, certainly, that her husband was. So to blame Julian Assange is just out of line. But of course, if Giuliani is, of course, being blamed, if he is at all, because there's been no news on that. Nobody in the U.S. media at all has published anything on his statements. It was on Fox News, but Fox News television, but Fox News website never even ran a story about his remarks about Julian Assange either. So they will be dismissed, and Trump would be dismissed as a partisan act to help the guy who gave him the White House. And I think that Trump should have the guts to weather that and do the right thing and pardon Julian Assange, simply because, as Giuliani pointed out, he's a publisher and does the same thing that mainstream media does by publishing classified information. Lastly, Greg Barnes, a member of Julian Assange's Australian legal team, spoke to Unity for J Vigil yesterday. And we have a pre-recorded video ready to go. And Joe, whenever you have that, please roll the interview that I did with Greg Barnes. He was in Cape Town, South Africa, but he's part of Julian's legal team in Australia. Joining me now is Greg Barnes. Greg is a member of Julian Assange's legal team based in Australia. However, he's now talking to me from Cape Town, South Africa. Greg, thanks for joining our program this evening.
Thanks, John.
So
Thank you.
Many of our viewers know who you are, but some don't. So could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved with WikiLeaks and Julian's case?
Sure. So I'm a barrister based in Australia, and I practice in the areas of criminal law and human rights. I first got involved with Julian's campaign probably way back in 2010, when the Australian government took what was really an outrageous view about Julian, accusing him of committing crimes under Australian law, which was palpably false. So I started advocating on his behalf through a group called the Australian Lawyers Alliance that I'm involved with. And from that point on, I then was involved with Julian in some political issues in Australia, and I've been a member of his legal team from Australia really for the past 5 or 6 years.
Well, it's interesting that you said that they tried to charge him or accuse him of committing a crime in Australia way back in 2010, because I have in front of me here an article from February 2014 from the Sydney Morning Herald. You may be probably familiar with this. The headline is, Julian Assange posed, quote, no real security threat to Australia. And it says, WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange has been an irritant, quote, and a gadfly, but not a significant security threat, according to former Australian intelligence security officials. These officials say that only one of 1,400 U.S. diplomatic cables relating to Australia published by WikiLeaks caused any major security concern, and no one was harmed as a consequence. This relatively relaxed view of Mr. Assange undercuts assertions by former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, who said that WikiLeaks' release of leaked cables was a grossly irresponsible thing to do and an illegal thing to do. So what I want to ask you is, why are Australian politicians, Australian officials, so reluctant to speak up for him now when we had that story? Why? Is it simply a fear of the U.S., or is it a herd mentality? Like those people in power, they must defend themselves against revelations that undermine the interests of such powerful people. What is the thinking there?
Well, look, I think it's a few things, Joe, and you've hit upon them in your question. But the first one is that there's a really unseemly, unhealthily close relationship between the United States and Australia, which has been dominant in this country's foreign policy for many, many years. Secondly, I would say that there's hostility in some parts of the Australian media to Julian Assange, mainly because he does their job better than they do. And the third point I'd make would be that the reluctance on the part of Australian governments to act and Australian politicians to speak out on behalf of Julian, I think is linked to the fact that they see him as being hostile to the United States and Australian interests. We need to remember that Australia, of course, participated in what many of us regard as an illegal war in Iraq, participated in Afghanistan. In fact, they've been willing partners of the United States in most of these foreign adventures and ventures over the past few decades. And so that sort of hostility, plus the fact that the security establishment in Australia is very conservative, groups like the Lowy Institute, which is an supposedly independent think tank in Australia, although hews very closely to the American line, is extremely hostile to Assange. And so what you've got is a dominant mindset in Australia which is hostile. Having said all that, Joe, I will say that the recently deposed Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, to whom I was fairly close because we ran some political campaigns together many years ago, had always a much more benign view of Julian Assange. When Julia Gillard was Prime Minister and made those absurd statements about unlawfulness of Assange's actions, Turnbull defended Assange. I can also say that the former Foreign Minister in Australia, recently deposed, Julie Bishop, was also relatively benign towards Julian Assange. And thirdly, I can say that Julian's father, John Shipton, and I visited Canberra recently, where the Australian Parliament sits. We met with a number of crossbenchers, independents and minor party MPs, and we got a very positive reception. So there certainly are pockets of support in Australia, and I think amongst some leading politicians in Australia, there's a more benign view on Julian.
Benign but pretty muted. I mean, there's still a fear to speak out, even if they know the truth here.
I think that's right, Joe. I mean, I think that if Julian Assange was a New Zealand citizen, for example, I would think that you'd find the New Zealand government, particularly the current Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, much more voluble in her support, because New Zealand actually has an independent foreign policy, unlike Australia. And so it has to be said that the efforts made by the Australian government to date have been few and far between. We were encouraged, John Shipton and Julian and I, by some overtures that we made earlier last year, at the start of last year. Unfortunately, Mr Turnbull's no longer Prime Minister and Ms Bishop is no longer Foreign Minister. But there's likely to be a change of government in Australia in the next few months, highly likely to be a change of government. The Labor Party, which is sort of like the US Democrats, and sadly, I have to say, I don't see a lot of support in the Labor Party for Julian Assange. In fact, some of its key spokespeople are bizarrely quite hostile to Julian.
I wonder if the US just sees New Zealand as less significant than Australia in allowing that government to take those kinds of positions. But you also mentioned the media, and I find it as a long-time reporter who spent 30 years in corporate media before I finally got out where I never belonged. I find that their behavior and their attitude towards Julian Assange and WikiLeaks is shameless, because they depended on him and WikiLeaks for scoops. They made money off of that. At least their newspapers made money off of that. They built careers, and now they've turned against him. And there's a tweet here from Mark Curtis. You might know Mark Curtis. He's a British historian, and he just tweeted 3 hours ago, from the time we're taping this. UK minister told Parliament yesterday that, quote, "There can be no doubt that media freedom is under increasing attack across the world." That's the quote. And then Mark adds, "Speaking 2 miles away from the only journalist in Europe being held in arbitrary detention. So, why do you think the press has turned so cowardly towards Assange? And it's not only what you said, that they're doing a job better than he is. Are there other reasons? And don't you see this as Western governments like this British minister, they are protecting the journalists who protect them, who protect their interests, who don't expose their power.
I think, Joe, you get no argument from me. I write a weekly column, ironically, for one of Rupert Murdoch's papers, the Hobart Mercury in Tasmania, and I wrote a column last Monday, which has been circulated widely on Twitter, fortunately, in which I made the point that with the exception of Nick Miller, who's a columnist or a journalist with the Fairfax Media Organisation, publishers of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age in Australia, Nick, to be fair, has been excellent on his coverage of Julian Assange. There have been a couple of other journalists in Australia who've been very sympathetic to Julian and understand the hypocrisy of their colleagues. But other than that, it's fair to say that the Australian media bizarrely ignores the most significant and high-profile member of the Australian media community. It's really odd. I mean, if he were a sports person in trouble, this would be front-page news. If he were a politician in trouble, it'd be front-page news. We put drug traffickers who get caught in Bali. They're front-page news, and any developments in their case are front-page news. And yet when we have, for example, Rudy Giuliani making comments as he did recently in recent days about Assange, I mean, this is the president's counselor, whatever you think of Giuliani and Trump, one would have thought the Australian media would say, well, actually, that's pretty significant. We should report this. This is what Giuliani thinks of a prominent Australian who's currently arbitrarily detained. But there was just nothing in the Australian media. Now, I think it's for all the reasons that you mentioned. There's hostility on the part of the many journalists who, by the way, depend on the security establishment. They depend on the security establishment for many of their stories in Australia. There's an unholy alliance between themselves and the Department of Defence, the security agencies, the police and politicians. And they would rather curry favour with those interests and continue to play with those interests, as it were, rather than standing up for what is a fundamental principle. Because the point is, Joe, that the attack on Julian Assange is an attack on one of what you would think is one of the core values of the Australian and global media, and that is press freedom. And to not support him, irrespective of what you might think about Trump and what you might think about alleged Russian collusion, and I don't buy in, I'm not buying that, but I'm just saying some do. Surely you can see that you need to put that to one side and say, actually, hang on, there's a fundamental principle here. And that's the line that I'm trying to push here in Australia. And as I say, with notable exceptions, it's been an uncomfortable ride because it's really hard to get traction.
Well, everything you've just said holds true for the U.S. media as well. There was nothing on Giuliani. He spoke on a U.S. television network, but that very network, Fox, didn't even write a story for its own webpage about that. I think there was one piece that in the bottom was mostly about the Mueller investigation that just put in the quotes about Assange, but didn't write anything about it. We're speaking with Greg Barnes. He's a member of Julian Assange's legal team based in Australia. Before I go on to my next question, could I just ask you to move back about a couple inches so we could see your full face? Yeah, that's better. Okay. We want the full beauty out there for our viewers, so thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Let's just talk for a minute, if you can update us, if you can, about the situation with Ecuador, because it's been bizarre. It's been gone months now. They indicated they wanted him out. And then, I speculated at the time that Ecuador, a very small country, going up against the most powerful country, if they have an asset that the U.S. is desperate for, they're going to try to squeeze what they can out of the U.S. for it. And then we've learned that that's pretty much what happened. And even, well, I didn't want to get into the Manafort thing, but somehow he played a role in negotiating this. So clearly, they want things from the U.S. Could be this IMF loan, because they're in serious debt to China, for example. Could be other things. Line the pocket of the current president. I mean, I wouldn't put it past them. Where do we stand now? They changed their position to seem several times, and the new Ecuadorian ambassador in London made a remark when he first arrived to the Ecuadorian media that it's between the UK and Assange's lawyers now. Where do we stand, if you can update us on what is going on with Ecuador's position now?
Well, I think Ecuador has had a myriad of positions because it's feeling a number of pressure points, and there are a number of complexities which are driving it. Firstly, there's no doubt there's been a huge falling out between the current president, Lenin Moreno, and his predecessor, Rafael Correa. And of course, Correa was a great champion of Assange. So there's that factor, personal factor. The second factor is the fact that you're getting these outrageous letters, Joe, which you'd know about, from the US Congress, effectively saying, look, if you don't hand over Assange, we can't really help you any more than, in terms of aid, etc., and economic development. And the third issue is, I suspect, an internal debate within the Ecuadorian government itself in relation to doing the right thing as a matter of international law and being seen to be a citizen of the globe which upholds international human rights law on the one hand, and on the other hand, having these other pressure points placed on it, which would put it in an invidious position. But I think it is significant that, well, perhaps let me go back a step before I say that. Let me just address the British issue. The impression that we've had, and I'm really only talking about some of the overtures we made in Australia earlier in the year, Joe. The impression we had from the UK was that the UK wanted to be rid of this situation. With Brexit and the government hanging by a thread, this was really an irritant. And therefore, it was really a matter for, it's really the pressure from the United States leveraging Ecuador and the UK sort of sitting there saying, well, you guys try and resolve it. When you've got a resolution, come and see us and we'll do whatever. That's the impression that we were given, and we could be wrong about that, but certainly the UK government has just maintained this consistent position that there's a breach of the Bail Act, that has to be dealt with, but you don't suspect there's any great venom in the United Kingdom position.
But the Home Secretary, I believe, has said that he'll get a warm welcome from the police once he gets out. So why? Yeah,
well, I mean, but Joe, look, that's the sort of talk you get from politicians. As a lawyer, I can tell you, and you'd know, Joe, you get that sort of talk from politicians. If somebody's on the run, if from their point of view, they use this sort of language. I think that the important Jeremy Hunt, who's the Secretary of State there, or Foreign Secretary, did make those comments standing next to Julie Bishop, the then Australian Foreign Minister, who was much more circumspect, to her great credit. And that's what I meant when I said that she was much less hostile, or certainly benign towards Assange. But I don't read the UK position. I mean, the UK effectively is a patsy of the US on this issue, as is Australia. And I think I'm with you. I think that the Ecuadorians actually do hold some cards here if they know how to play them. But I'm not sure that they do know how to play them, and that's why the position keeps changing.
Yeah, that could be. Yes, it was the Foreign Secretary, not the Home Secretary, who said that. Yes, who said that. Well, I think MI5, MI6 would be quite pleased to have him brought to the U.S. in chains, and on their own, without any prodding from the United States.
Well, can I just say, sorry, Joe, just to interrupt you on that. I had a conversation in Australia middle of the way through last year with someone whom I respect enormously from that sort of world, if I can put it that way without saying anything further. And they made that point to me. They said, look, you've got to understand, security agencies in Australia, the United States and the UK hate Assange with a passion because they are obsessed, as you and I both know, obsessed with secrecy. And particularly I do a lot of work around that space, and they've become particularly obsessed since 9/11. And so they regard Assange as the devil incarnate. And, of course, MI5 and MI6 would do whatever the Americans asked them to do, including, in my view, seeking to subvert the judicial process in the United Kingdom in relation to extradition.
That leads me exactly to my next question. Because we had on a legal expert a couple of weeks ago, Francis Boyle, in the U.S., was familiar with the extradition treaty with the UK, the US-UK, because he represented some IRA figures who Britain wanted extradited. So he was putting through the motion that there would be a court appearance and that the argument could be to try to delay and move it to the European Court of Justice, of Human Rights, And then, so that, in other words, there would be an appearance before a judge in the UK on an extradition request from the US. And on the other side, I'm hearing the argument that that'll never happen. That the moment he steps out, they're going to arrest him, and he'll be on a plane within hours back to the US. Where do you come down on that?
I think it's a really interesting question. To be fair to the UK judiciary, it has been quite robust in recent years at the upper levels. And I'd emphasise at the upper levels, the appeal court judges. I think the real issue here is whether or not there's going to be subversion of that process by the United States just putting him on a plane and getting him out of the country. I can say to you now, Joe, that in the area, for example, of immigration, where I do a lot of work for asylum seekers and where the Australian government is determined to put people back on planes and get them out of the jurisdiction, they often just don't wait. You can make an application to court and they come along and say, oh, sorry, your client's already at Sydney Airport and boarded a plane. They're outrageous. And I think governments governments would never have done this 20 years ago, I can tell you, but they do it now. And I do think that's a real fear. But I think if this matter were litigated and agitated in the English courts, there is a greater respect for human rights issues. I think the difficulty with extradition is this, that whilst countries like Australia and the United Kingdom, in theory, won't extradite people where the death penalty is a possibility, in the case of Assange, all that has to be said by the US is that, oh, well, that's, he's not going to be charged with any offence that carries a death penalty. But having said that, I'll just give your listeners and those watching this example that in Australia some years ago, this became an international story. And this is where, again, I certainly wouldn't be trusting the Australian government if it had any involvement in the extradition process. And it might have, because he's an Australian citizen. There have been notorious examples in Australia where Australian police have allowed people to go to Indonesia knowing that they were trafficking drugs, just so they can get caught by the Indonesian system and face the death penalty. And in fact, 2 were killed, executed by the Indonesians last year. So I no longer have any great faith in the police forces and security agencies of countries like Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States when it comes to doing the right thing in extradition treaty cases.
Well, is it just the right thing or the legal thing? Do you know what the law is in the UK?
Well, it's both.
Both.
Actually, you're right. You're right, Joe. It's the right thing and the legal thing. But you can subvert it, and I've seen them subverted in the Australian context. And I think certainly in the UK, I can say that there have been examples where the higher courts in the UK have stopped the British government extraditing people or sending people who were seeking asylum back to positions of danger. They have done that. Now, I think the issue in the Assange case will be the alacrity with which my colleagues will move and would have to move in order to protect his position, because otherwise, as you say, they'll just put him on a plane and say, sorry, he's in the air. And then, of course, you've got the issue about jurisdiction and about whether you can get him back. And sadly, since 9/11 particularly, Joe, I've lost some faith in the way in which government and government lawyers conduct themselves in these types of high-pressure proceedings and political proceedings.
Well, thank you, Greg. Bonds, I have one final question. I'm hoping that it puts a slightly optimistic note on our conversation. There have been a few hopeful signs in the last couple of weeks. The UN reiterated, the UN Advisory Board had reiterated its statement that he's being held under arbitrary detention, should be released and compensated. And then there were 30 European parliamentarians who signed a statement. There was a statement by Rudolph Giuliani that we discussed earlier. John Pilger's been to see him twice now in the last few weeks, see Julian Assange, and he reported to us that he seems to be in relatively good spirits considering what's going on, and he's intellectually as sharp pretty much as he's ever been. He's still Julian Assange intellectually. So, I mean, are there any reasons to be optimistic at all right now?
Well, the other thing I would add to it is this, that we're certainly the view we take in Australia, and that is Julian's father and his mother and others I work with here. We have an election campaign coming up where both sides are vying for office. We have had success in the past in Australia with the David Hicks campaign, Joe, which you may recall. David Hicks was an Australian who was shunted into Guantanamo Bay. There was huge pressure on the then Conservative government to get him back. He did end up coming back to Australia. And we have had some discussions with groups potentially about running campaigns during the context of the election, saying bring him home. I mean, I think a lot of Australians take this view, and certainly the Australians that I speak to, and when I speak to others who are in the polling game, if you like, or the community attitudes game, their view is this. There are a lot of people in Australia who don't necessarily agree with Julian on everything, and there are certainly, there's no doubt, he lost some support in Australia because of the perception, wrongly in my view, but the perception that he'd somehow helped Trump to win the election. However, those very same people, in fact, I was talking to one recently, are now saying, come on, there's got to be an end point to this. You can't keep this guy locked up for this long. He's an Australian citizen. The Australian government's got to do something. We do it for other people. We do it for people all the time who get caught in Asia with drugs. This guy's committed no offence, bring him home. And so we certainly continue to work on that. And we've now got an election campaign coming up probably from about March onwards, Joe, the campaign, until about May. And we've got an opportunity there to really try and break through.
Well, that's great, Greg. That is a slightly hopeful sign at the end. So I appreciate your time again, taking your time out of your day in Cape Town to speak to us. And that was Greg Barnes, who is a member of Julian Assange's legal team in Australia. Thank you very much, Greg. Good to talk to you.
Thank you very much. Okay,
all the best. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Interesting interview that he conducted with me yesterday from Cape Town, South Africa. And in my headlines, I mentioned that Cassandra Fairbanks had last Monday been in London to see Julian Assange at the embassy, and she wrote a piece headlined that Assange's living conditions are more akin to a dissident in Stasi-era Germany than an award-winning publisher with asylum. So we welcome Cassandra Fairbanks. Cassandra, are you back from London? Are you in Washington?
Yeah, I'm back in DC, unfortunately.
Ah.
Thanks for having me, by the way.
Sorry?
I said thanks for having me, by the way. And yeah, I'm back in DC.
Glad to have you here because you can give us some fresh information about what you saw. How difficult was it for you to get the interview, first of all, with him?
Well, I didn't interview him. I just stopped by for a visit. But well, last year when I went and visited, I just organized it with him and his lawyer, and it was really simple, and the embassy wasn't really involved at all. This time I had to fill out a form detailing like where I work, my employer's address, all my social media accounts. If I wanted to bring my phone in, I would have had to provide the IMEI and serial number and all kinds of other information about any device I brought. I figured it'd be easier just to leave it behind. But yeah, there was a little bit of a process this time.
And you, in terms of the phone, when they say bring it along, they still keep it at the front desk, don't they? You can't bring it into the room and use it as a tape recorder, for example.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that they would hold it at the front.
Yeah.
I ended up just having my boyfriend hold it for me outside.
Yeah. So you went to London just for this interview. Did you have did you know that you had, meeting with Julian?
17 hours.
Did you know about this before you left, or did you go there and have to wait for approval from the embassy?
Well, I was going to London anyways, so it wasn't planned around this, but I wasn't sure if I would get approved or not until 2 days before. So
right. So tell us now about your experience entering the embassy and going in to see Julian, and what the meeting was like with him.
Okay, well, getting in was pretty similar, aside from, filling out the paperwork and stuff like that, having to get approval from the ambassador. It was all pretty similar to last year when I went. They scan you with a metal detector when you go in and search your bags, which didn't really bother me because Julian has a lot of enemies and I'd rather that they be doing that. But then once I was inside, the amount of cameras and microphones was, I mean, it had to have been double or triple what it was last year. Last year there was, cameras here and there, but they weren't everywhere. Now, no matter where you're standing, no matter where you are, there's a camera picking you up, and from pretty much every angle also, which was a little bit dystopian and creepy. And we tried to go into another room to get some privacy so that we could speak freely, and they came and pounded on the door, and they were like, no, you have to go back. So we ended up in the conference room, and we tried to put on like the radio and a white noise machine, but it was still it was so obvious that we were being recorded that we ended up just passing notes, which is a little bit insane to me.
Was most of your discussion with him in a written form then?
I mean, pretty much, yeah. We spoke, obviously, but a lot of things we had to write down so that it wouldn't be picked up by the microphones or the cameras.
How long were you with him?
It was supposed to be an hour. I ended up staying, I think, a little over 2 hours before they threw me out.
Threw you out? Did they come into the room and literally tell you had to leave?
Yeah.
What can you tell us? Was this off the record? I mean, your discussions with Assange, or can you tell us something about what you learned from that?
Yeah, no, everything was off record. He's not really allowed to speak about politics or his conditions of his asylum right now. So I wouldn't want to jeopardize him in any way by discussing that. And it's a shame, because the thing that really struck me is that he's not allowed to talk about his feelings or his thoughts on social media right now, or to the public or press, and that's bad, but he can't even speak freely about his thoughts and ideas to his friends and to reporters at the embassy where he's living, and that, I feel like, is a really scary thing.
So you can tell something about his demeanor and how he's holding up under these terrible conditions.
I mean, he was in really good spirits. We were joking around and had a good time. He was, as well as could be expected given the situation. He looked a little bit thinner than last time I saw him, but overall, he was he was tough. He's still bright, still sharp. They haven't broken him, so that's good.
Is your feeling that they won't be able to break him from what you saw?
No, I don't think they will be able to. He's strong and he knows how important his fight is, and I don't think that he'll give that up for anything.
Yes, he knows. So you don't know about or how he's eating, or he certainly doesn't have exercise other than maybe a exercise bike that he has, I think, in his room.
Yeah, I don't know. There was a lot of fruit around. We had some coffee. The coffee was good. I don't really know about his eating or anything like that. I can say that it was warm, at least in the lobby and the conference room and the office and general living spaces. I didn't go into his room, but I know that a lot of people were really worried about the heat situation. It was warm in at least the common areas.
So without divulging any details, can you say that he is, despite being cut off from the outside world in terms of the internet and having few visitors beside his lawyers, and now there seems to be a window opened where people like yourself and John Pilger and Angela Richter, the theater director, went to see him in the last few weeks. But can you tell us that he seems to be informed about what's going on, A, in the world politically, and B, about his own situation, his own case?
Oh, absolutely. He's definitely filled in on, world affairs. It's Julian, he's not only aware and filled in on what's going on, he has very interesting perspectives. He's brilliant. His mind is still, going. He's exactly how you would expect. Strong opinions, very smart opinions, things that you wouldn't necessarily think of. And so on that front, he's really doing well, I think. It's just unfortunate.
Now, here in
those with the world.
Yeah. here in the U.S., prisoners, and I think in federal prisons, are not allowed anymore to get books. And it was always difficult to send a book to a prisoner anyway. Does he have access to books and newspapers? Do you know?
I'm not sure, but I would assume so. I think he can get books and things
And
like that.
they're not denying a paper, print edition of a newspaper, even so he could actually read a paper and get his hands dirty with ink, and not have to because he can't go online.
Yeah, I think there were papers around, there were books around. He definitely has access to information. It's more that it's less that they don't want him to know what's going on in the world. It's that they don't want him to share his opinions. And I think they're succeeding on that.
And if he does to someone like you can't talk about it. So they've effectively shut him up.
Yeah.
Did you get any impression of what his relations are like with the staff at the embassy?
It wasn't as friendly and warm as when I went last year. That's for sure. Last year, I remember after I left, I commented to someone, I was like, oh, wow, at least he has like really cool people around him. And, you know, the people at the embassy seem really nice. And I remember being really happy with how cool everybody was. This time it definitely wasn't like that. They seemed a lot colder, a lot more standoffish, a lot more strict. I noticed that there was like a sign in the bathroom directing him which way the toilet paper had to hang on the roll, and it was like the most serious little note ever, and I was just like, this is insane. Like they're cherry picking all these like weird little things, and it was just bizarre. It wasn't the welcoming situation that it was last year.
So it went from being cool to cold, is what you're saying. They were cool before. So that kind of a note in the toilet, it's interesting. That clearly is part of a strategy to try to drive him crazy to get out so he leaves. That's what they were trying to do. Isn't that your impression? They want to get him out because it's difficult.
It seemed like they're just nitpicking like little things to be irritating. And you know, the embassy was very clean when I went. I can't even imagine it being not clean. So I feel like they're like picking on these little tiny issues like toilet paper and stuff just to be annoying and want to drive them out, you know?
So clearly that other room you went into didn't have a camera or a microphone in it. That's
well, I asked that and he was like, well, it's best to assume that everything is bugged. But there weren't like visible, it wasn't as obvious as in the conference room. The conference room, it's like you're sitting in a fish tank.
Oh, that's pretty extraordinary.
Hallways too.
Yeah.
The hallways, all like every bit of the hallways had cameras. It was insane.
I'm curious, does he know why they're suddenly allowing visitors? Do you have any insight into that?
Well, they had put out the new protocol, which after his isolation mostly ended, they had put out rules saying, you know, what guidelines visitors have to take and stuff. And I guess they stuck to letting him have people come as long as they get the approval.
So what is your overall
by the new rules?
So he's not leaving. He's as defiant as ever. The government's slightly relaxed his conditions by allowing visitors like yourself. Mm-hmm. What is your understanding of the current situation in terms of what Ecuador is trying to do right now? They're giving mixed signals. They want him out, then it's not important. And then it's between the UK and Assange's lawyers, and we have nothing to do with it, and all this stuff. Do you have any particular insight into that?
Well, I mean, around DC, there's been a lot of talk about how it's Pence, and that Pence and Pompeo have been really adamant about getting Julian, and that it hasn't been like so much the people like Trump and his people, but Pence. Although I think that's kind of just passing the buck, but that's been the most of the talk I've heard around here. And I think Ecuador has some debts and they're looking for a bailout. And the US said, you know, if you don't go after Chevron and you hand us Julian Assange, then we'll be more willing to play ball.
Yeah.
And I think that they want that money, and that the new president doesn't particularly care about Julian Assange. He doesn't care about press freedom the way that their previous president did. And so I think he's willing to make a deal with the devil.
as American officials don't care about press freedom.
Mhm.
Without telling us what he said, if you can, was he aware of what Giuliani said, for example? Is he aware that he's been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize? It was actually the same day that you were there that McGuire nominated him. So maybe that news hadn't filtered into you either.
I hadn't heard about the Nobel Peace Prize while I was there, but we, we did talk about Giuliani a bit. I see Giuliani really, really frequently because I hang out at Trump Hotel a lot, but and he's always there.
Oh,
so I had spoke to him.
I got to start.
Before.
Yeah, I've got to start hanging out there too now. It sounds like
you should. It's the place to go. Everybody always jokes that
I was there once.
Everybody jokes there that I'm the unofficial WikiLeaks lobbyist. As soon as I see like Sarah Sanders or anyone there, I run up with questions about WikiLeaks. I'm kind of a pest, but it's the place.
Well, that's good. That's what a reporter should be.
Yeah.
A good reporter is a pest. Yeah, you have to be able to do that. I was there once. I was turned off by the decor, and then I didn't go back. But that was a mistake on my part. So,
you got
typical Trump style.
Hey, I'll take you.
Well, I'm sure you'll be there when I go. But yes, let's do that. Well, Cassandra, thanks very much for your time with us today, and it was great that you went to see him. And let's hope that the news gets better.
Okay, thank you so much.
If you want to stick around for the discussion, please stick around. But if you have to go, we understand. Okay.
I'm on my phone. But...
Bye-bye now.
Right, bye.
Bye. Mike Gravel. Senator Mike Gravel is now with us from near Monterey, California. Mike, welcome back to the program. How are you?
Thank you. I've got one insight, I hope.
Well, I hope you have more than that.
That it's on the Nobel Peace Prize, and I'm sure the lady who nominated him realizes that doesn't go to Sweden. That goes to a committee of the Norwegian legislature. And that committee can be lobbied. In fact, that's what the whole process is. So in the course of, because they'll make the announcement sometime in October of 19, but I think it would be very valuable for people to contact the various peoples on the committee, or if you could find out the committee membership, Joe, and put that up so people could then get that information and contact the committee and lobby them. And this is, of course, how Obama got to get the Peace Prize, because the deadline is in January, and she's met that deadline. And of course, Obama had just been elected. He was two weeks into his presidency when he was nominated to the for the Peace Prize. And of course, the committee, in my mind, foolishly said that, well, if we give him the Peace Prize, maybe he'll act like a peace president. Well, that obviously did not take place. And in fact, when he made the speech before in receiving the Peace Prize, it really was a war speech. It was just wars. And of course, when you talk about peace, there's no such a thing as a just war, because just wars are set up in advance. It's like the First World War setting up the Second World War, when the First World War was supposed to end the war to end all wars. It's ridiculous. But since the tactic, and I would hope that Julian would be out of the embassy and free and safe before next October. But in the meantime, I would hope that we would try to lobby the committee, individual members on the committee, that this would be very, very significant for the cause of world peace. And that is through a process of informing the people in the world as to what their leaders are doing. And that's what Julian was doing par excellence. So that's the insight I want to add. I don't know if I could add anything more other than we talked in terms of the last time I was on about getting the Labour Party to put pressure on the May and her party and I believe a member of the labor backbencher did come up with a statement about supporting Julian Assange. And so here again, if we could get Corbyn to the minority leader, if we could get him to weigh in, that would put really great pressure on the UK government, which might react by just bagging it rather than get all the heat. So those are my two insights, Joe. I don't think I can add anything more than that.
Well, I think those are brilliant insights, particularly the idea of lobbying the members of the Nobel Committee, which should be public information. It's something I could dig out, and I would publish that, and hopefully people would take that up. People watching us, and we can make more out of that on social media too, because that would be a tremendous thing if, in fact, he would get that prize. I didn't see a lot of media coverage about his nomination, which tells you something right there. That again, the establishment media, which does the bidding for powerful people rather than people, didn't see that as newsworthy. Just as they didn't see Giuliani's remark as newsworthy. Mike, I don't think you were on last week when we talked about Giuliani, but you know what I'm talking about. He was on Fox News.
Oh yes, no, I'm very well aware. I was very excited by Giuliani's statement. I thought it might have a little bit of suction on moving Donald Trump, but maybe at some point Trump, is so erratic in what he does that he may pick up on Giuliani's statement in a conversation with Giuliani and react to it with a tweet. So that's possible in the future. Let's just hope. But there are several tactics that are being employed. One, the Nobel Peace Prize, and we can campaign on that. Two, we can campaign on trying to get the Labour Party to endorse the release of or the stopping the British government from encircling the embassy so that Julian could come out as a free person. So we've got two areas and I think others can be developed as you're going forward with advertising. And I want to commend you, Joe, for what you're doing in this regard, because I don't know of anything else that's truly organized to try and help Julian. And if Julian is free, later on free to move out, I think that Consortium News would get a lot of credit for what it's done.
Well, that's very kind of you, Mike. And we're just doing what we can. I mean, it's a big story. This is an historic press freedom case. I don't know why any journalists wouldn't be all over this, just as objectively reporting on what's going on.
That's right. But then you don't want to put your hopes too much in the mainstream media, which of course is corporate owned and plays to the corporate interest. And one of your persons was pointing out earlier that you just know if you're in corporate media, you don't have to get orders to act a certain way. You just know that if you act a certain way, that will advance your career. And so that's the name of the game, is that mainstream media knows how to advance their career. But this is the same thing in politics. Why is it that the likes of Henry Kissinger and others are always promoted? And generals are promoted when they've done terrible jobs in their careers. Or politicians the same. I'm still resentful of the treatment that mainstream media gave to McCain. McCain never saw a war that he didn't want to enter into. And he still had the view that we should have won the Vietnam War, which of course is ridiculous. But that's McCain's leitmotif, so to speak. And then, of course, you've got these generals like, the only adults in the room are a bunch of hawks. That's really who the adults were. And now poor Trump has gone from bad to worse with what's his name, who's a security advisor, Bolton.
John Bolton.
Yeah, he's horrible. He's horrible. So at least the other generals were more gifted in hiding their main thesis, which is continued war. And so then you get the liberals who excoriate Trump because he was going to pull out the troops. That doesn't speak well of the liberal invasionists, and we have a whole cadre of them.
Yeah, I like that term instead of liberal interventionists, liberal invasionists. Well, speaking of Kissinger, of course, I wonder who lobbied for him because he got the Nobel Peace Prize, which put a stain on that prize.
Well, that was well, of course, it was a co-issue. He and his Vietnamese negotiator were both given the Nobel Peace Prize, but the Vietnamese person would not accept it. He did not feel that was an action of peace. And of course, Kissinger would reach out for any honor that he could get to ensure his continued viability to mainstream media.
Well, at least in Kissinger's case, they waited until after he, was involved in the secret bombing of Cambodia, the overthrow of an elected government in Chile, and numerous other crimes to give him the prize. Where in Obama's case, they just gave it to him in advance and waited for him to commit these atrocities.
Well, they gave it to him to try to influence him, but you couldn't influence Obama. He was on his own pedestal.
I don't think they're going to try that again. At least I hope not. Give somebody an award so that they would live up to it rather than having lived up to it.
Well, that's right, because it was so embarrassing with that. But they every so often they do mainstream stuff. But with Julian Assange, you're quite right. It's what he's done at this point in time that's why he should be issued the Peace Prize. It was his actions that brought about the whole Arab Spring. There's enough fodder out there to feed to the committee as arguments for issuing the prize to Assange. But unfortunately, the decision won't be made till September, October of next year. And I would hope that we would have liberated Julian from the embassy safely to to go where he would like to go.
Well, just to completely confirm what you said about how corporate media works, having worked in it myself for too long, almost 3 decades, you absolutely nailed it. You don't get the memo saying report this. You know what they want. And if you step out of line slightly and try to put in a story that is going to be undermining of the agenda that corporate media has, and that agenda, especially on foreign news, is to support American interests abroad, not to report objectively what's happening in an international crisis or in any international story where countries are just clashing because they have interests. And nobody's a good guy. They're all bad guys. Some are worse than others. But to present the Americans as the good guys and to minimize and delete and omit the positions of Iran, of Russia, of North Korea, of Cuba, all the so-called enemies of the United States, which suddenly become the enemies of the corporate media too. They no longer have an objective view and see these countries as players in an international dispute or an international story of any kind, so that it becomes the American story in America. Now, other nations do that with their media too, but they don't seem to pretend like ours does, that we're the best and most objective and blah, blah, blah. So you were absolutely hitting the nail on the head. Did you want to say something else, Mike, about that?
No, I think that I'll have to excuse myself at this point in time, but I do want to encourage you to continue what you're doing in this regard, using Consortium News as the main public advocate for Julian Assange's freedom.
Well, I thank you very much for that, Mike. And thanks for joining us today.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. We're going to have a brief musical interlude in just a few minutes. I just wanted to back up what Mike was saying again about Bolton and Pompeo. They've seemed to have taken over this decision on whether to withdraw from Syria or not. Trump, for whatever reason, he has good instincts sometimes. I don't know who's telling him things, but every once in a while, he'll make the right pronouncement. And to remove troops from Syria certainly was one. And now he's been backtracking after visits from Lindsey Graham and statements from John Bolton and Mike Pompeo, the National Security Advisor and Secretary of State. And that we're not really going to move out. Now there are conditions. We got to wait till ISIS is completely defeated. So we see in a very public way how the president of the United States, whatever we think of him, he was elected, whatever we think of the Electoral College and the system, he's the president, and he decided he wanted to remove troops. And that's certainly within the prerogative of the U.S. president to do that as commander-in-chief, and yet he's being cut off at the knees here. And that's why we're afraid that would happen with Assange if Giuliani should indeed convince Trump that he should pardon Julian Assange. We would see these kinds of guys like especially Pompeo, a former CIA director, and Bolton, and then the former CIA director like Brennan with his perch on MSNBC, and all the other talking heads, former intelligence officials coming forward to decrying this idea. And you'd have to think Trump, based on his behavior, would back down, but let's hope it's different. Are we ready to go to music, Joe Booth?
We are indeed.
Okay, let's take a little break.
Dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks, doing hard time for these WikiLeaks, trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat, and then they gag you. You don't get to speak, and when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masters of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Free speech, it's the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people of the red, bottom blue, you keep them in bed. Seeing the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat. Until I'm deceased underneath a freezing red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, kill the messenger. Need a solace, any questioners, you kill the messenger. And outside my window a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey what my Mickey keeps, dying in my kidneys weak. Silence in my risky tweets is what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace like 7 years under threat. Cause I've released 7 vaults, they upset. They under the rape sentence, but the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. MLK to Gandhi, take aim and eliminate. And And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need a solace, any questioners, you kill the messenger. When the vote count is irregular, you kill the messenger. You caught spying on a senator, you kill the messenger. Removing voters from the register, you kill the messenger. Need a solace, any questioners, you kill the messenger. In my dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks. Doing hard time for these WikiLeaks. Trying to bring the truth out, man, it only gets you heat. And then they gag you. You don't get to speak. And when you get the leak, they try to hit the leak. The masters of the masses, they want the shit to street. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Playing on the regular. You kill the messenger. Free speech is the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people want the red, not the blue, you keep them in bed. Seeking the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat. Until I'm deceased underneath a freezer red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. And outside my window a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey what my Mickey keeps, dying in my kidneys weak. Silence of my risky tweets, what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace, like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace, like 7 years under threat. Cause I've released 7 vaults, they upset. They ended the rape sentence, but the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. And I'll pay the Gandhi, take him and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. You kill the messenger. You kill the messenger. Democracy dies in the darkness. Feeling sold out, even though I'm keeping strong. But can I hold out when every bit of freedom's gone? They want me rolled out, never to sing freedom song. I wanna see the sky, I wanna feel the rain, but gotta keep away from windows, that's some window pane. It's just a shame, couldn't have planned out all our dreams. Now I scream, cause there's a man in the machine, but the train is off the tracks, and damn, it's losing steam. I wanna call Christine, I haven't seen since 013. I'm missing life like 3 strikes each night. Seems like 3 nights ain't right. Can't fight, space light, hate life, wanting to be snake-like, shutting off this gray life. In the dark, can't make light, but where I'm headed now is brake lights. Where I'm headed now, they break lights. Counting days like brake lights, feeling weight like brake lights. Had a great life, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Out of place like brake lights, in my face like brake lights. Counting days like brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Sit here asking, what have I done? If these strings were cut, I'd see my son. And if I could just fly from this place, then I'd hold you in my love embrace. And if I could just speak to you now, I'd renew my vow and be in the now. Is this me in denial? Wanna remove stress from your brow and pay you back some way, somehow. But it's painted black, can see the way back now. But how's the house and how's your mom? I doubt the way the media portrays me makes you hate me. But to think you see that daily makes me crazy, that just ain't me.
This is without a doubt going to be this generation's free Mandela movement. Every single generation must fight again the same battles that previous generations have fought.
Brake lights, count days like brake lights, 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 brake lights. trying to bring the truth out, man, it only gets you heat. And then they gag you, you don't get to speak. And when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masses of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Free speech is the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people of the red, bottom blue, you keep them in bed. Seeing the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat. Until I'm deceased underneath a freezer red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need a solace, any questioners, you kill the messenger. And outside my window a figure creepy creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey with my Mickey keeps dying in my kidneys weak. Solace in my risky tweets is what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace like 7 years.
I'm asking you to make a noise, a big noise, and to keep making a noise until my son is freed. We need to make our protests against this brutality deafening.
I don't want to work for you no more. My hands are cracking.
what we can do is become WikiLeaks. So yes, we need to go to the embassy. Yes, we need to protest. But what we need to do is become the media, which is exactly what Julian has done. He's not only has he become the media, he's done it so well that he has eclipsed their every achievement to infinity. And this is what we have to do. We have to take on that spirit of providing for humanity the services which are not being, and that's what Jimmy Dore is and Graham Elwood is. It's what all of you, it's what Consortium is. It's what all of this truth telling is about.
In my dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks. Doing hard time for these WikiLeaks. Trying to bring the truth out, man, it only gets you heat. And then they gag you, you don't get to speak. And when you get the leak, they try to hit the leak. The masters of the masses, they want this shit to street. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Playing on the regular. You keep the messenger. Free speech is the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people want the red, while the blue you keep them in bed. Seeking the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leech till you cease, and I see your defeat. Until I'm deceased underneath a freezer red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. Goldman Sachs is your Goldman Sachs is your creditor. You keep the messenger. And outside my window a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey what my Mickey keeps, dying in my kidneys weak. Silence of my risky tweets, what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace, like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace. Feeling cold now, but got the heater on. Feeling sold out, even though I'm keeping strong. But can I hold out when every bit of freedom's gone? They want me rolled out, never to sing freedom song. I wanna see the sky, I wanna feel the rain. But gotta keep away from windows, that's some window pane. It's just a shame, couldn't have planned out all our dreams. Now I scream, cause there's a man in the machine. But the train is off the tracks, and damn it's losing steam. I wanna call Christine, I haven't seen since 013. I'm missing life like 3 strikes each night. Seems like 3 nights ain't right. Can't fight, space light, hate light. Wanting to be snake light, shedding off this gray life. In the dark can't make light, but where I'm headed now is brake lights. Where I'm headed now they brake lights. Counting days like brake lights. Feeling weight like brake lights. Had a great life. Brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Out of place like brake lights. In my face like brake lights. Counting days like brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Sit here asking what have I done? If these strings were cut, I'd see my son. And if I could just fly from this place, then I'd hold you in my love embrace. And if I could just speak to you now, I'd renew my vow and be in the now.
I am stumbling underground. I am blinkered, I am blinded, and I've forgotten how to let the light in. How to let the light in. Cause I am shrouded, I am sun-starved, I am stumbling underground. I am blinkered, I am blinded. So won't you show me how to let the light in? How to let the light in? Now I know the crazy horses riding on and on through his territories of torture where the nights are deep and long. On a pilgrimage for truth, and under guarded skies of watchful skies, I'm hoping the sunbeams get through. How to let the light in? How to let the light
I'm asking you to make a noise, a big noise, and to keep making a noise until my son is freed. We need to make our protest against this brutality deafening.
I don't wanna work for you no more.
Well, thank you very much for staying with us. We're now joined by Andrew Fowler. He's talking to us from Sydney. Is that correct, Andrew?
That is correct, Joe. Yeah.
Very good. I'm glad you're up early on a Saturday morning to join us. We had a couple of guests before, Senator Mike Gravel, former U.S. Senator Mike Gravel, and who made the point that after Julian's nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize, that people should lobby the committee, because there's a committee that can be lobbied about that. And if we flood them with that, requests that Julian win the award, it might do something. And then we had Cassandra Fairbanks on, who just met with Julian on Monday at the embassy in London. So Andrew, tell us a little bit about yourself and how long you've been involved with the WikiLeaks issue.
Well, I've been a reporter for longer than I care to remember. But I started work in London, I worked on newspapers there, moved to Australia, and eventually worked for Four Corners program and Foreign Correspondent program. And it was while I was working for Foreign Correspondent that I got to track down Julian in the early days and interview him for a program that we did, one of the first programs about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. And the response was terrific. In fact, Assange went on to, and WikiLeaks went on to win a very prestigious award in Australia, the Walkley Award for outstanding journalism. So there was a lot of support in the early days.
Why do you think there was support in the early days and not now?
I've absolutely rattled my brain trying to work that out. But certainly in the early days, Assange was being supported by the heads of news organizations who wrote open letters supporting him. But there's been a campaign against Julian Assange, as you know, to denigrate him and to denigrate the work of WikiLeaks and anybody else who stood up and revealed information in the public interest. And Assange is a victim of that. I suppose he's the totemic victim. He's the person that has been singled out to be denigrated among all others. I mean, you've had Seymour Hersh unable to get published in his own country. You've had other examples of people struggling against the system. But Assange has been the lightning rod of it all.
Do you think it had something to do with partisan politics, particularly in the U.S.? Because when WikiLeaks were revealing damaging information about the George W. Bush administration in Afghanistan and Iraq, liberal newspapers like the New York Times were publishing that stuff right in the front page and profiting off of WikiLeaks work. And now suddenly the perception, I think incorrect one, is that the release of the Democratic National Committee emails and the Podesta emails hurt Clinton. Well, she hurt herself because she said the things she said, and the things that were written about her or in those emails was not made up by WikiLeaks. But now suddenly he's seen as delivering the White House to Trump, etc. So do you think now he's public enemy number one? Frankly, I think the intelligence agencies were after him all along, whoever's in power. But politically and the newspaper, that they may have been influenced by that.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting issues. One being the intelligence agencies being after him. I think they certainly were after him. I think that they were, and I think Daniel Ellsberg used this phrase to me. He said they would work the back end. In other words, once Assange ended up in the net in Sweden, they were never going to let him out. And I think if you go through the history of that, most people know the history of that, you'll see that that was the case. On the question of the change of attitude by the mainstream media, New York Times, Washington Post, look at the Washington Post, look what they did with Edward Snowden. I mean, here's somebody, they benefit directly by Snowden's material that he released, and as did the general public, and yet the Washington Post editorial board published an editorial saying that he should be charged, he should be dealt with as a criminal. So I found that absolutely remarkable. But I think it actually went to the truth of where some elements of not journalism, not journalists in the mainstream, but very often the managers in the mainstream and the owners sit on this issue. As for the New York Times, well, the relationship between Julian and the New York Times has been rocky and bad, and they've done some bad things to him. Even in the early days, they were excuse me, bit of a cold. I hope it wouldn't catch me. Even in the early days, they were saying that he wasn't a journalist. They were questioning whether or not he was a journalist, and to do that to somebody who's being pursued by the state is tantamount to locking them up and throwing away the keys. And to abandon him the way that the New York Times did in the early days was just appalling.
Well, as you said, he won an award in Australia for journalism. I think that was part of the title of the award. So you don't give that to people who aren't journalists. But let's not forget the formerly known Manchester Guardian, because the Guardian has probably been the most vile paper in terms of attacking Assange than any of them, and particularly the reporter Luke Harding, who my theory is the guy wrote a best-selling book called Collusion, and there's been no evidence of collusion yet, despite all these indictments. And the prosecutors in the U.S. clearly say when they're announcing at the DOJ that we haven't found evidence of collusion yet. So if this guy's in search of evidence to back up, I think, to save his own reputation. So he will buy this ridiculous story about Manafort having visited him. What do you, their relationship was rocky too, with Russ Bridger apparently breaking with him, and they were very close. I believe they were also using him as a source and benefiting from that. What can you tell us, any insights into what's going on at the Guardian?
Well, I think that the problem with the Luke Harding and David Collins, the Ecuadorian reporter, is that the story hasn't been told, and everybody, from what I understand, has been looking for the Manafort connection with Assange, and no one's found it. No one's managed to support the Luke Harding story. Now, for the Guardian, that has to be a problem, that the story is just sitting out there dead and it's being pursued by people who are looking to find those links. And if they're not finding them, then there's something wrong substantially with the story. And the Guardian needs to investigate that. The Guardian needs to make a public statement, not only saying it stands by the story, but also what it's doing to verify the story. Because that was, in fact, if you like, the smoking gun. That was the gotcha moment that people were looking for. And it hasn't stacked up.
Well, like you, I've worked a long time in big established media like the Wall Street Journal and the Boston Globe and the Sunday Times of London. And I know that kind of a mistake is a fireable offense, or at least it used to be. You would not, like the guy, almost as bad as the guy at the Spiegel, who was just axed after making up stories for a long time. So maybe Harding only made up one or two, but it's so consequential, this story, that for him to remain on the staff and continue working. And he's had a long history of writing crazy things from Moscow, people going after him in the airport. They were going into his apartment, the FSB, all of this stuff that never really seemed to check out. Why would they tolerate this guy? And what about their own reputation that's at stake here? Why wouldn't they sacrifice him at least?
Look, here's the problem. I think had it been a story about anybody else, then he would have been sacked. But because it was about Assange, somehow a whole set of different rules apply, not only the Guardian, but also I think across the spectrum. The antipathy towards Assange appears to outweigh the failure of journalism at the Guardian in this particular case, and I don't understand why that is. I've argued with journalists in Australia that Assange should be represented by journalists here, that there should be a representation made, and nobody's interested in taking it any further. There are very few people that are prepared to speak up publicly, and I think that is part of the cover that allows Luke Harding's story to sit out there unchallenged. And that's a problem for the Guardian. It's a problem for us too, because let's not forget that the Guardian did do some remarkable work with Assange. David Lee, Luke Harding, Nick Davies. I mean, Harding, or Davies, and he's a particularly good reporter, yet he has a terrible falling out with Assange. And I've talked to Nick Davies about this, and he just feels that Assange is somebody who he can't trust, and etc. It's just a really bad feeling in the media about Julian Assange. Now, why that is? Maybe jealousy. I mean, maybe jealousy. Our industry is full of very jealous people. Maybe it's because they just feel that they've had enough of Assange and that they personally can't stand him. But I think you should put your personal interests to one side and deal with the facts and recognize the great work that Assange has done and support him for that, if nothing else. Well, you don't have to like somebody to support the work they do. Very often, people I've worked with I haven't liked particularly very much at all, and yet we produce some good work together. We produce some great work together, and that's what journalists should do. That's what I think journalism is: putting up with problems and getting the truth out. And it seems to me that the personality clashes between Assange and other people have got in the way of some really great journalism, and they should let bygones be bygones and move on and support Assange in his quest for a decent hearing and freedom. And certainly he needs the support of Australia in this particular instance, something which is palpably missing. Many pieces of speculation about why that's the case. This country is extremely close to the United States. We don't put a foot out of place without following the US normally. So that's one of the issues. I mean, I think Assange called Australia a suburb of Washington, and I think that's not a bad description. So that is the real problem. I think that we've got this problem of dealing with this personal clash, and also there's the politics of it at an international level. And there may be a change of government here. There may be a Labour government here. There may be a change of government in the UK. I mean, those things I would think would be beneficial to Assange, and you would hope that a change of government here would lead to representations to the Labour government in the UK, or change of government in the UK, to actually find a passage, a way to get Assange out of that awful hellhole he's in at the moment and back home again to Australia.
You know, if liking sources was a requirement, I don't think there'd be much printed in a newspaper anywhere. That's
absolutely right. And I think if you like your colleagues, well, there wouldn't be any teamwork. I mean, you just have to put up with things. I find this is, it's as though the sort of the journalistic star complex seems to have created a whole bunch of people who think that they are separate from the rest of the world, as though they have special rights and special privileges. And I think they need to basically just get down off the pedestal, get back down in the streets, and work in the public interest. The Guardian, as I said before, has done some remarkable work with Assange, but they were uneasy times, and I've catalogued them in, everybody else has in various books. But I think that it would serve all our interests if we put this stuff to one side and dealt with the biggest threat that we've got, which is the United States of America and its president. I can't think of anything worse than Julian Assange ending up in the US with the current administration.
Well, first, you really made an extremely important point about the journalists living more for the lifestyle today than for journalism. It's not about the work, it's about being a star, as you put it. And that's really corrosive throughout the entire industry, in newspapers as well as TV. And I think that is a major problem why journalists who are careerists before anything else will suck up to power and live vicariously through the power of people in government, rather than realize that we have a different power, which is to hold those kinds of people to account. I think it's a greater power than political power. And then journalists were never really attracted to the political power. They would have gone into politics. They like the power of holding these guys to account. But you also touch on Trump. I think any administration would, under the power and the sway of the intelligence agencies, would want to get Assange and not treat him very well. Let's put it that way. But Trump presents a whole different issue here, because I think that the Assange story is gotten sucked up into Russiagate, obviously. That's why why Assange is no longer seen as someone to be trusted, even though everything they've published is true, unlike most newspapers. But Trump, Jill Abramson, who was the New York Times bureau chief in Washington here during the invasion, lead up to and during the invasion of Iraq in 2003, went along with Judy Miller and all the other false stories that they ran to gin up the enthusiasm for that war, and to the point where the Times had to publish an apology in their newspaper to their readers for getting that story wrong. Well, Abramson just published a memoir, and in it she criticizes the Times for their anti-Trump bias. And this is not a Trump supporter, but she's finally looking at the way that her former newspaper, the Times, it has been covering Trump. And I think it goes across the board on Russiagate. We've seen just the other day that the Times ran a story that Paul Manafort had given polling data to a Ukrainian guy he worked for, who passed it on to a Russian oligarch. Well, within 24 hours, they had to publish a huge correction that he actually passed it on to Ukrainian oligarchs, not Russian oligarchs. We saw a story a year or so ago on ABC. This guy, I can't remember his first name, Ross. He'd been their intelligence reporter for years, probably maybe an asset, it seemed the way he reported things. And he reported that Michael Flynn, the former NSA chief for national security advisor for Trump, had met with the Russian ambassador during the campaign. Big story on ABC. Within 24 hours, nope, sorry, it was after the campaign. The guy got fired, basically. Huge difference. Did they collude before the campaign? It was after the election. He was already the designated national security advisor, and that's what every national security advisor coming into an administration does, meets with various foreign ambassadors because they, especially Russia, obviously, to set the groundwork for the new administration. Nothing wrong about that. There were other stories about the Russians having hacked into electric grid in Vermont. Big story, Washington Post. 24 hours later, oops, not true. So we've seen this continuous, I think it's part of this mania that's taken over the corporate media about Trump, who is an odious figure, as you rightly point out, whose policies are worse than he is. In fact, I find him a joke. I don't really hate the guy. I did laugh at him. But this obsession with Trump and with Russiagate and with Russia, which is very, very dangerous, as we know, is what's taken over. And I think that's part of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I mean, is Jill Abrams saying that, excuse me, is Jill Abrams saying that the fixation with Trump, the bias, in fact, is part of that failure to be objective, to look at the facts and try and work out what's going on, rather than they just rush into print and get the story out there because it's an anti-Trump story? Is that part of the problem? Because that's as dangerous as we can see by the stories you're coming out with on the other side. It's as dangerous if you, as they say, if you set out on a road of revenge, you must first of all dig two graves. I mean, be very careful because you can be blinded by your biases, and that's a problem on both sides.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And to be a professional in this business means to put your emotions and your personal feelings aside and look at the facts. And if you're too close to a story, you're not the right reporter for that story, obviously. But the corporate media has been consumed by this obsession, and I think Assange has gotten swept up into that, where he was lauded as a journalist before. He's now some public enemy number one. But what's troubling about that is, of course, as we said, the intelligence agencies always hated him because he's exposing their secrets. He is exposing the crimes and corruption of very powerful people, individual people whose standing in society and in the power that they have is threatened by him. That's why they want him. Why would journalists want to join up with those kinds of people? He's not threatening their interests. He's threatening powerful people's interests on the side of the people. What the journalists should be on the side of the people against the state. They're taking the side of the state.
Yeah, I mean, Julian Assange has produced the kind of journalism that I aspired to in the 1970s and 1980s, which was if you like, the Watergate style investigation, that kind of stuff. As much as we know about what happened with Watergate and about the relationship between the reporters and the intelligence agencies and what have you, and the government, the fact is that lit a fuse. That was the golden time, if you like. And now we seem to have rolled right back, where the state has so much control over what journalists think is acceptable. I've had conversations with journalists that don't think it was right to reveal the DNC emails. They said, look, this was wrong because it would help Trump. And I said, but it was a truth that Hillary Clinton was getting an unfair advantage, and they were trying to shoe her in ahead of Bernie Sanders and briefing against him. That's in the public's interest to know. It's in the interest of the United States population to know. And to have a journalist argue that, no, that's not right, you've got to be careful because what you do might have unintended consequences, it certainly beats me. It's a long way from where I came when I came into journalism. And giving an explanation to that is, I think, longer than we can really spend talking about it. But it's got, at the moment, a lot to do with many things, but crucially to do with money and the amount of money that journalists actually have to spend time investigating material. A lot of these errors, I think, come from feeding the beast. So information comes in, you get it from a source. I mean, the government knows damn well there's no money in journalism. They just drop the story and the journalist runs with it, or the leak runs with it, the official leak, and then it gets out, and then comes the correction. But by then the damage is done. It's the great weakness we have. I mean, money doesn't buy you everything, but but a lack of it stops you from being free.
It's a lack, and it's the different way to distribute the resources. I remember in a meeting I went to with the head of the Columbia Journalism School in New York, and it was a long time ago, because he was saying that what changed journalism in America was a $1 million contract that was given to the TV personality Barbara Walters. And that before that, journalists, even on TV journalists, except for the owners and the top management, lived in the same communities more or less as people they were writing for. And suddenly that nobody made anywhere near that kind of money. And once those floodgates came open, huge amounts of money go to TV personalities who replaced anchormen or presenters, people who actually read news, who came from newspaper and wire service backgrounds. So you might know Walter Cronkite is the most famous American TV anchorman, as we call him here. And he worked with UPI, I believe. And Dan Rather also worked in newspapers or wire services. These people are actors. They get huge amounts of money, and that money should be going to investigative reporting. And it's dried up because it's going to the big stars, as you said. So it's a star system now, the worst thing that could have happened to our profession.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, and that's not just in television. I mean, television is, it attracts the best and worst in people, but newspapers as well. So you can be a star reporter, but being a star reporter on television because you become saleable is where I think, as you quite rightly point out, the problem really lies. But also not funding journalism because there's not enough money in newspapers, I think is a reasonable argument, which is where The Guardian comes back in again. And The Guardian, as I said, has done some remarkable work and continues to do remarkable work. Now, in my opinion, they do have a missing part of their jigsaw in Assange. There seems to be something truly missing in the way that the story, particularly the story we talked about earlier, written by Luke Harding, was not only allowed to go through without the obvious checks I would have thought being made on, for example, cameras in the streets, or did you see the documents? Who is the person who is your informant and who is writing the story with you? Those sort of checks, if they were done, were not done properly. And if they weren't done, then I think your point about it being a sackable offence may be a step too far, but it's certainly an offence which should be publicly exposed, and The Guardian should be open about the errors that it made. As I say, they haven't been, and they should be.
And do you think on any other story they would correct it? They do publish corrections. All newspapers do, correct? But this is a particularly different story, right? They cannot seem to admit this.
That's exactly right. I have made mistakes myself, and I will admit them as we publish a mistake. We publish an error, and we would correct it. The worst thing you want to do is to make a mistake. But the problem with this story is the bad blood between Assange and The Guardian, and they kind of, in this thing about taking sides, you end up being somebody who's seen to be vexatiously publishing material if you admit it's wrong. But if you don't admit it's wrong, well, I think the problem is compounded by that. Best to admit the error and explain the error than to let it go on, because, as you say, I think it does damage the corporate masthead of The Guardian that I write for very often. I mean, as I say, it's a great newspaper. I know people that boycott it and say they won't. The people that support Assange on one side won't buy The Guardian, won't support The Guardian. I think it's got to be an argument that's a bit bigger than that. I think you just have to hold The Guardian to account for what it said, can it prove it, and take it further. It's an important matter. It's an important matter for The Guardian, not just an important matter for journalists. Boycotting The Guardian, well, I mean, you can boycott the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all the other mainstream media, but you've just got to be like any journalist. You've got to go through, read the good stuff, check the veracity of what's being said, and make up your own mind.
I wonder if at The Guardian they're figuring out what is worse, what would be more damaging, to keep the story up like that and not say anything, or to admit error in this story. I think in other stories they would easily have corrected it by now. But this one, because of what's at stake here, to try to nail this collusion story, they might feel that the damage would be so great that it could really hurt the entire narrative being told by multiple media outlets about this collusion story, not just their own paper. So maybe they would rather just leave it out there. That's what it seems like they're doing.
Well, that's what they are doing. I mean, maybe they hope, or maybe they will produce the evidence. This is what they, maybe they're being told that we can produce the evidence. Maybe this is the argument that's being had. I'm not privy to this, but there's a reason why the story sits up there unchanged, not updated. And it's quite curious as to why that's the case. I would have thought that you'd actually either say, we've actually got more information and we'll bring it to you next week, and, you know, whatever you're going to say to explain what this thing is just hanging out there like it's like a swinging corpse, you know, over the masthead. It's just not a good look for a newspaper with such a formidable reputation.
It's not, but the Russiagate story must go on. So that correction and removal of that story would do enormous damage to that. In general, about journalism, can it recover from this period? I mean, you talked about a journalist who told you that he can't support Assange. Was that a young journalist or our age? Because he's a young journalist. No. So this would, you know, not to say that the old days were better, but I guess I am saying that. But fundamental changes have taken place here in the financing of it, and the attitude that journalists have about their job and what they feel they should be doing, and the responsibilities they have, and the very rudimentary tasks of journalism 101. There's two sides to every story. Although this has not necessarily always been the case when it comes to foreign reporting in particular, international news in the U.S., they've always omitted the viewpoints of what is considered to be the enemies of the U.S., Russia, Iran, China. These countries hardly don't exist. We Western reporters explain to our Western readers what an Asian person is thinking, rather than going to them and let them speak for themselves. So that's an old case. But if we've gone into a new phase here, can we recover from this? That's my question.
I mean, that's a huge question to ask. I'm not convinced we can, but then again, I've also met a lot of young reporters who like to hear this discussion and actually are motivated when they hear people like us talking about these issues. They've never heard them discussed before in the kind of detail we're talking about, and they get it. I mean, they get what's happening. I actually have a faith in the future, and I have a faith in the strength of young journalists to do good work, but they can't do it alone, and they need to have mentors, and they need to have people speaking out and supporting them when they take a risk and when they get into trouble. And very often in this very fractured society we now have, they end up being out on their own, because the whole collective nature of a newspaper standing by its reporter in extremis sometimes fails, and the journalist is abandoned. Now, in the case of the person I was talking about, people I was talking about before, you know, they have a can I call it a rather jaundiced view of the world. They don't believe that there's any place for collective action, because no one stands together anymore. I mean, the unions are smashed. There's no collective working together. I mean, you know, in the newsroom floor, it's really, really rough. There's no time to think. They're competing against each other for diminishing number of jobs. And consequently, you know, the idea of being responsible to the public, I would have thought, is one of the last things on their mind. They're actually just thinking about, can they survive the next week? Can they hold down the job? Can they get the job from the other person? That kind of competition in the newsroom stops any form of collective action. But on the other hand, we have the consortium of investigative journalists working and gathering information and spreading it out across the media and digging into important issues of tax avoidance. I think that may be a course of action that, you know, is the future, but it's the big multinational stories that are going to get covered in that way, and you're not going to get the sort of stuff that Snowden and Assange brought us through that sort of journalism. It's not going to work in that way. It's too difficult. It has to be, if you like, what I call the old system of going to a single newspaper, a single group of people you can trust, and working with them closely. You can't spread this stuff across the planet. That's not really answering your question, but I think I wouldn't be sitting here if I knew all the answers to the questions you just asked me.
Well, are you saying then if another Ed Snowden comes up, another batch of files like that the big media, like The Guardian and the New York Times and the Washington Post, won't take it now, even though they did the first time around?
No, I think they would take it, and I think that is at the moment, the only course to take is to go to a single outlet. You can't do a consortium of investigative journalism.
I see.
It just doesn't work. No, you've got to go. In other words, you have to use the old media. You have to use the old media, and you have to engage. You have to engage the old media the way that you're engaging the old media. You're saying to them, you can't behave like this. The Guardian has to do something about the Luke Harding story. You have to engage, and to take them on. I mean, they may have their problems. I mean, the New York Times certainly had its problems dealing with Assange, and the Washington Post with Snowden. But engaging them, and trying to keep them on course may sound like a very weak response to a really big problem, but I don't see any point in just howling them down and boycotting them. I think you just have to say, what is the argument? Why don't you talk to Paul Chadwick, write to Paul Chadwick at the Guardian and say, what's going on with this, the story of the Luke Harding story? Because of all the bad blood we know with Harding and Assange going way back, and his stuff out of Russia, you quite rightly pointed to earlier. But just howling them down, I don't think it's going to work. I think you have to work with. You also have to work with individual journalists. So you get somebody you know in the newspaper who's a good journalist who will fight for your story, and you go to that person, not to the masthead, but go to the individual and work on an individual basis. Because going to the masthead will mean that your story is going to be given to somebody who's whatever, who knows who it might be. Go to the individual person that you've tracked, much the same as Snowden went to Glenn Greenwald because of the writing that he'd done supporting WikiLeaks work. And that was a very smart move. He didn't go to The Guardian. He went to Greenwald. He went to the individual. And that's the solution to it. So I'm more of, although I'm a collectivist, I'm actually an individualist as well. I think focusing on the individual is the way to get the stuff through and to stop the sort of the Judith Miller, fiasco. Well, I would call it a fiasco. I mean, it was a deliberate policy the government to do that with her, and she was a willing and compliant agent of them. That's not an original thought, I know, but I thought I'd throw that in rather than going to the general newspaper. Go to the individual.
Well, that's great insights there. I mean, Greenwald had the wherewithal to stand up, though, to editors, as we know, and to push that into the paper. They didn't want to publish the Snowden thing, as we now know from the story. They've made a film about it. So he stood up to them. Too many of my former colleagues, I feel, have taken on the mentality of management, of their editors, and they're in the club. They're in the club, and we're not in the club anymore. I mean, I'm not working for mainstream media. At least I'm not in the club anymore. I didn't like being in the club very much. I'm very happy to be outside. I'm very, very fortunate to have become the editor of Consortium News, and the idea of being journalists who got fed up with their editors killing stories would gather together as a consortium. This was Robert Perry, an AP reporter, and then Newsweek, who had broken the Iran-Contra stories, the most important ones about Oliver North. AP did not want to publish his story revealing Oliver North's name and what his role was in the Iran-Contra scandal, and they actually spiked the story. They sent Bob and his partner back to get more and more interviews, and the story was as airtight as it can be. And by mistake, you might know this story, the Spanish Wire translated it, and it went out in Spanish to Nicaragua and elsewhere in Latin America and Spain, and they had to put it out in English. That's how we know about Oliver North. They've tried to kill it. So Bob had the same problem at Newsweek, where they told him not to do stuff because it's not for the good of the country, meaning the good of the rulers of the country. That's what they think of as the country. So he started Consortium News. But Julian Assange's case, this is why this is such a crucial, historic press freedom case. Because if he could somehow beat this, it could rejuvenate, I think, and give it symbol to young journalists as well, that you could face the most undaunting odds, the most terrible mistreatment, and still win, because the truth that you've published is stronger than these forces trying to silence you. But of course, on the other hand, it looks very pessimistic right now situation that he won't be able to get out, and that bodes very, very ill for the future, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right, Joe. I think that is the problem, that he is such an emblem of press freedom that it's the very thing that gives him his strongest case becomes his weakest point. That to allow Assange to be free would encourage others, which is why he was singled out in the first place. An attempt to stop an Ed Snowden arriving, and of course Ed Snowden did arrive. And the idea of allowing Assange to be free would be terrifying for people who wish to manipulate the agenda, which is basically what intelligence agencies and governments try and do all the time. Is actually what they do full-time to try and control the media. So to allow Assange to be free would be something that would cause them immense pain. The power of public opinion could change their minds. But doing that would require something to reignite the support for Assange, not only in the journalistic community, the broad community. I think there's a general support for him among my non-journalistic friends. They ask after him, and they're genuinely concerned about him, and ask people in France as well. I have friends there, and they also ask questions about Assange, and they generally fear for him and they support him. But this isn't represented in the way that I don't get this representation in the media of him being supported. So he's supported in the mass population, if you like. Generally, people say, "Well, what is that guy? How's he going? What's happening?" But and why is he still there? And why isn't the government doing anything about it? And he's an Australian. Why isn't he being represented? But these stories, it's like they've run out of puff. Nobody wants to run the story anymore. Everybody's just grown tired of it. It's an old story, which is a really jaundiced way to look at the situation that the journalist and publisher Julian Assange finds himself in. Too many years locked up in that place. You'd have to have a heart of stone not to feel sympathy for him as a human being, let alone as a journalist.
There is one glimmer of hope we should mention. A couple of months ago, the #2 legal counsel at the New York Times was giving a speech to some judges on the West Coast of the United States, and he pointed out that we don't like Julian Assange, but we are against him being prosecuted, because if he's prosecuted for publishing classified information, we could be next. And in fact, that's what the Obama Justice Department called their New York Times problem, that they wanted to go after him as well, and they stopped short. Even though the Espionage Act does allow prosecution for mere possession and dissemination, politically, that's a disastrous move, because it would open up the rest of the media to similar prosecution, and it would also look very bad for any government to try to do that in the context of what we believe we have a First Amendment of freedom of speech. So if the Times is against him, they won't go to the editorial page and promote him, however. So I think they're in a quandary there. They don't want him prosecuted, because an administration like Trump's, who hates the media so much, as we've seen, could actually go ahead and do that. It would open up a door to him to do this, maybe. He's acting even more and more bizarrely now over this wall. So if any administration, the Nixon administration didn't go after the Post and Times, or Senator Mike Gravel, who we had on earlier on the show, who Dan Ellsberg gave the papers to and then read them to Congressional Record, which is legally protected. But once he published it as a book in Beacon Press in Boston, the government could have gone after him. The judges in the Pentagon Papers case wrote that in the majority opinion. You're liable after. It's just pre-restraint the government cannot do. So if the Times realizes they could be on the block here, and all the other major media, they've got to come out now and support Assange just to save their own asses right now. It's really strange that they're not doing that.
Well, one of the things that has just occurred to me is that, looking pretty closely at the points you just made there about the New York Times not supporting him, and they should, because they're next, and that's the problem that journalists have, is that I suppose it's possible that the United States Justice Department is looking at prosecuting Assange for something that is not related to journalism. They may be looking for a way around this issue and prosecuting him for something else. Now, I don't know what that might be, but I'm sure there are fertile minds. If, as Pompeo said, the ex-CIA director said, that this is a hostile terrorist organization, and and Sessions, the former Attorney General, said that priority number one was prosecuting Assange. They must have looked at the First Amendment problems and come to the conclusion that they could reach out to him in another way. I'm not sure, but that would be my concern, that they would bypass those First Amendment arguments and go at him from a different direction. But again, it would still be trying to silence the journalists. So that's why journalists should stand up for it, because if they're going to do him on this non-journalistic argument, then they'll go for you as well for something else. They'll fit up the editor of the New York Times with some misdemeanor that they found in his tax returns or something.
Oh, that's absolutely correct. That's a very scary thing that you just said. Andrew, I just want to thank you very much. We've come to the end of this vigil that we hold every Fridays now from 4 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, so we can get you folks from Australia on as well early in the morning on Saturday. And I really appreciate your coming on and giving us your thoughts.
Thanks very much, Joe. It was a pleasure. I just hope it adds a bit and helps Assange in his quest for a decent life and freedom as a journalist.
That's what we're trying to do. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
So that ends this 12th vigil for Julian Assange. And we want to thank Senator Mike Gravel, who came on earlier, Greg Barnes, one of Julian's Australia-based lawyers, who gave me a recorded interview from yesterday that we played, and for Cassandra Fairbanks, who appeared earlier to talk to us about her meeting with Julian Assange last Monday this week at the embassy in Ecuador. So we hope to see you again. Remember now, we go on at 4 p.m. Eastern Time until 7 p.m. Eastern Time. So this is Joel Lauria saying goodbye, and thanks for joining us tonight.